Imagine you're sitting in a room with someone you've never met before, and suddenly you feel a wave of overwhelming sadness within you, even though the person is smiling and acting fine. Or imagine walking into a crowded space and immediately knowing that something terrible happened there without anyone telling you anything. What you're experiencing isn't magic. It's not paranormal. It's something far more profound and scientifically grounded than most people realize. Carl Jung called it the collective unconscious, and he believed it was the hidden layer of the human psyche that connects all of us, that contains the emotional and psychological residue of all humanity, and that empaths are unusually porous to this shared psychic field. For nearly a century, Jung's theories about the collective unconscious were dismissed as mystical or unscientific. But modern neuroscience, quantum physics, and psychology are now confirming what Jung intuited more than 100 years ago. In this deep essay, we're exploring one of the most misunderstood concepts in psychology: how the collective unconscious actually works, why empaths are uniquely vulnerable to it, and most importantly, how you can harness this understanding to transform from a victim of collective unconsciousness into a conscious channel for collective healing. This isn't surface-level self-help. This is depth psychology at its most profound, and it will fundamentally change how you understand your sensitivity. Stay with us as we journey into Jung's most revolutionary discovery, the collective unconscious, and how it explains why empaths feel everything so deeply. What is the collective unconscious? Jung's revolutionary concept. To understand the collective unconscious, we first have to understand what Jung meant by the term unconscious. Sigmund Freud, Jung's predecessor, believed the unconscious was primarily personal. It was the repository of your own forgotten memories, your repressed emotions, your desires that society wouldn't allow you to express. Freud's unconscious was like a personal vault, unique to each individual, filled with your individual trauma and experiences. But Jung went much deeper. He observed something that Freud had overlooked. There were patterns showing up in human psychology that couldn't be explained by personal experience alone. Jung noticed that patients who came from completely different cultures, who had no contact with each other, who had never read the same books or heard the same stories, were describing identical symbols, identical dreams, identical psychological patterns. A patient from Europe would describe a dream with a wise old man figure. A patient from Asia would describe the exact same archetype. A patient from Africa would independently discover the same pattern. How was this possible? How could people who had no shared personal experience arrive at identical psychological symbols? Jung's answer was radical. There must be something deeper than personal experience. There must be a layer of the psyche that is shared by all humanity, that exists independent of individual learning or cultural transmission. He called this the collective unconscious. And he defined it as the deepest layer of the human psyche, containing universal patterns, symbols, and instincts that are inherited, not learned, that are present in all humans across all cultures and all times. To use Jung's own words, the collective unconscious contains the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution, born anew in the brain structure of every individual. This is crucial to understand. The collective unconscious isn't something you learn from your parents or culture. It's something you're literally born with, encoded in the structure of your brain, inherited through evolutionary development, common to all human beings. Think of it like this. Your personal unconscious is like the basement of your individual house. It contains your personal memories and experiences. But beneath that basement, underground, stretching underneath all of humanity, is a vast cavern, a collective psychic ocean, the collective unconscious. And this ocean contains patterns, emotions, and energies that have accumulated over thousands of years of human evolution. Jung believed this collective layer was as real and as influential as the personal unconscious, perhaps even more influential because it carries the weight of all human experience, all human trauma, all human wisdom, all human yearning. And here's where it gets relevant to empaths. Most people have thick psychological walls that keep them insulated from this collective layer, but empaths, their walls are permeable, their boundaries are thin, they're naturally open to the collective unconscious, and they're picking up signals from it constantly. Archetypes, the universal patterns of the collective unconscious. Now let's understand what actually lives in the collective unconscious. Jung called them archetypes. An archetype is a universal symbol or pattern that appears in mythology, religion, literature, and psychology across all cultures. And it appears independently, without cultural transmission or learning. For example, consider the hero archetype. Every culture on Earth has hero myths. The hero who faces the dragon, the hero who overcomes the enemy, the hero who conquers fear and emerges transformed. From ancient Mesopotamia to medieval Europe to modern Hollywood, the hero's journey follows the same pattern, same challenges, same transformation, same victory. Or consider the shadow archetype, the dark evil, threatening force that opposes the hero. Every culture has devils, demons, evil sorcerers, external forces that represent what is dark and dangerous. Or the wise old man archetype, the sage, the mentor, the one who possesses secret knowledge. Merlin, Gandalf, the medicine man, the sensei, appearing across cultures and centuries with barely any variation. Or the great mother archetype, nurturing, protective, creative, but also potentially devouring and overwhelming, appearing as Mother Nature, Mother Earth, the divine feminine across all religious and mythological traditions. Or the innocent, the naive one, the one who seeks happiness and safety, appearing in every culture's myths and stories as a distinct psychological pattern. Jung identified dozens of these archetypal patterns, each one representing a universal human experience, a universal human emotion, a universal human challenge. But here's what's crucial to understand. These archetypes aren't just interesting symbols. They're active. They're energetic. They're psychological forces that move through the collective unconscious. And they influence human behavior, human perception, human experience, whether we're conscious of them or not. When you see the hero's journey in a movie, you're not just watching a story. You're resonating with an archetypal pattern that's encoded in your own collective unconscious. You're experiencing something that echoes with all of human evolution. It triggers something in you that's older than consciousness itself. For empaths, this archetypal resonance is intensified. They don't just intellectually understand the hero's journey, they feel it. They experience it viscerally, they absorb it, because their nervous systems are directly picking up on the archetypal energy moving through the collective unconscious. The collective emotional field, how empaths tap into shared feelings. Now let's explore something Jung hinted at but didn't fully articulate, because the science didn't exist yet. The idea of a collective emotional field. Jung understood that the collective unconscious wasn't just abstract symbols and patterns. It contained actual emotional and psychological content. Generations of human emotion, historical trauma, collective grief, collective rage, collective hope. Think about it this way. When a huge tragedy happens, when a city is devastated, when a nation experiences loss, there's a collective emotional field that forms, a shared grief, a shared trauma, a shared activation of the nervous system across the entire population. Most people are relatively insulated from this collective field. Their attention is on their personal life, their personal problems. They might intellectually know about tragedy happening elsewhere, but they don't feel it in their body. They don't carry it. But empaths, they're like psychic antennas. They're picking up on this collective emotional field automatically, without even trying, without even being aware of it. They're absorbing the collective pain that's flowing through the culture, through history, through the collective unconscious. Jung documented this phenomenon. He noticed that his most sensitive patients would become overwhelmed during times of collective crisis. They would describe feeling everyone's pain, everyone's anxiety, everyone's fear. Even though nothing personal had happened to them, he realized that these empathic individuals were literally tapping into the collective unconscious. They were receiving transmissions from the broader human collective, not just their immediate personal environment. Imagine the collective unconscious as a vast emotional Wi-Fi network. Most people have their Wi-Fi turned off. They only feel what's within their immediate personal sphere, but empaths, their Wi-Fi is always on. They're constantly connected to the collective network, receiving signals from everywhere, from everyone, from the entire field of human consciousness. This is why empaths often describe feeling overwhelmed in crowded places. It's not just the people physically present. It's that they're picking up on the collective field of human emotion that's constantly active, constantly broadcasting, constantly influencing the psychic atmosphere. When you walk into a room where something traumatic happened, most people don't perceive it. But an empath walks in and immediately feels the residual emotional energy, the trauma that was imprinted on that space, the emotional echoes that linger in the collective field. This isn't mystical. Jung believed it was neurological. Empaths' brains are more permeable to subtle signals, more open to picking up on patterns and frequencies that most people filter out, and they're picking up on signals that originate not just in the present moment, but in the collective unconscious itself, which contains emotional content from generations, from centuries, from the entire evolutionary history of human consciousness. Historical trauma in the collective unconscious, generational pain. This brings us to one of the most profound and disturbing aspects of Jung's discovery: historical trauma living in the collective unconscious. Jung understood that trauma doesn't just affect the individual who experiences it. It leaves an imprint on the collective unconscious. And that imprint is accessible to sensitive individuals, particularly empaths. Consider the historical trauma of slavery. For centuries, millions of people were brutalized, their families torn apart, their humanity denied, their bodies and souls tortured. This created an enormous wound in the collective unconscious, a generational trauma that didn't just disappear when slavery ended. An empath born generations after slavery ended in a different country with no personal connection to slavery can still tap into that collective wound. They can still feel the reverberations of that historical trauma in the collective field. They can still access the pain and rage and anguish that was imprinted on human consciousness. Jung documented similar observations about the trauma of war. He lived through World War I and witnessed World War II. He noticed that sensitive individuals worldwide were experiencing psychological breakdowns during these times, not because of personal loss necessarily, but because they were absorbing the collective trauma flowing through the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious, Jung realized, is like a psychic archive. It stores not just universal patterns and archetypes, but also historical emotional content, generational trauma, ancestral wounds, cultural grief, and for empaths, this is both a burden and a calling. They carry this historical trauma in their bodies, in their nervous systems, They feel pain that isn't personally theirs, but that belongs to ancestors, to cultures, to all of humanity. Many empaths report feeling inexplicable grief, rage, or despair that they can't trace to personal cause. This is often because they're tapping into historical and generational trauma living in the collective unconscious. Jung believed this wasn't accidental. He believed empaths were naturally called to witness this collective pain, to bring consciousness to it, to process it, to help humanity integrate its wounds. But this is only possible if the empath becomes conscious of what they're experiencing, if they understand that they're not personally broken or flawed. They're simply picking up on collective trauma. Without this consciousness, the empath becomes a victim of the collective field, drowning in pain that isn't theirs, unable to distinguish between personal emotion and collective emotion, overwhelmed and fragmented. The empaths as receiver, opening to the collective unconscious. Now let's explore how empaths actually function as receivers of the collective unconscious. Jung understood that the human psyche has different channels or frequencies through which it receives information. Some people are tuned primarily to rational/thinking, some to sensation/physical reality, some to feeling/emotion, and some to intuition/unconscious knowing. Empaths are typically people who are highly developed in both the feeling function and the intuitive function. This dual sensitivity makes them extraordinary receivers of information from the collective unconscious. The feeling function allows them to perceive emotion and value with unusual depth and nuance. The intuitive function allows them to perceive patterns and possibilities that exist at unconscious levels. Together, these two functions create what we might call a psychic radar. The empath's nervous system is literally wired to pick up on subtle signals, emotional currents, archetypal patterns, collective energies that most people completely miss. Modern neuroscience is now confirming what Jung intuited. Research on highly sensitive people shows they have more active mirror neurons, more neural connections between areas related to empathy and consciousness, more activation in brain regions associated with attention and integration of information. Their brains are literally wired for reception. They're built to perceive subtleties and nuances that other brains filter out as irrelevant. They're natural receivers of information from the collective unconscious. But here's the crucial point. Jung emphasized, this reception is not passive. Empaths aren't helpless victims being flooded with information. They're active receivers. Their consciousness can learn to modulate what they receive, to filter, to set boundaries, to receive intentionally rather than being unconsciously overwhelmed. This is why Jung was so adamant about empaths developing consciousness. Without consciousness, they're like radios with no volume control, receiving every frequency at full blast, unable to distinguish signal from noise. But with consciousness, with intentional development, empaths can become like sophisticated receivers. They can tune into specific frequencies. They can amplify what matters. They can filter out what doesn't. They can choose what to receive and what to block. Jung described empaths who had achieved this consciousness as tuned instruments. They could perceive the collective unconscious with precision and clarity. They could sense what needed to be brought to consciousness, what needed to be healed, what was seeking expression through the collective field. Shadow in the collective unconscious, humanity's disowned darkness. One of Jung's most important contributions is understanding that the collective unconscious doesn't just contain light and wisdom. It also contains shadow, the collective shadow of humanity. Just as individuals have personal shadows, the parts of themselves they refuse to acknowledge, the darkness they project onto others, so too does humanity have a collective shadow. This collective shadow contains all the evil, cruelty, violence, selfishness, greed, and destructiveness that humans have ever perpetrated, all the genocides, All the wars, all the oppression, all the exploitation, all of it is recorded in the collective unconscious. All of it leaves an imprint. All of it is still active in the collective field. Jung saw clearly that nations, cultures, and entire humanity project their shadow onto enemies and scapegoats. We see in other groups the darkness we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. We fight wars against external enemies that are actually representations of our own disowned shadow. The problem, Jung understood, is that when we refuse to acknowledge our collective shadow, when we pretend we're all good and righteous, that shadow doesn't disappear. It grows stronger. It accumulates power. It unconsciously drives our behavior. For empaths, this is particularly challenging because they can feel the collective shadow. They can sense the darkness that humanity is collectively denying and projecting. They can feel the accumulated rage, the violence, the cruelty, the evil that humanity has perpetrated and is perpetrating. Many empaths describe feeling overwhelmed by the darkness they perceive in human consciousness, the cruelty, the callousness, the capacity for evil. They feel it as a constant pressure, a constant activation, a sense that something is deeply wrong that nobody else seems to notice. This is because they're tapping into the collective shadow in the collective unconscious. They're feeling what humanity is collectively avoiding, what humanity is refusing to integrate, what humanity is unconsciously acting out. Jung believed that empaths have a crucial role in this. They must witness the collective shadow. They must feel it. They must bring consciousness to it. They must refuse to participate in the collective denial and projection. But this is extraordinarily painful unless the empath understands what they're experiencing and receives support in processing it. Psychic contagion: how collective emotions spread through empaths. Let's explore a phenomenon Jung called psychic contagion, the way emotional and psychological states spread through the collective unconscious like epidemics. Jung observed that emotions are contagious, not just through social networks, not just through conscious communication, but through direct transmission via the collective unconscious. When enough people in a collective feel a certain emotion or belief, that energy becomes amplified in the collective field. It gains mass. It becomes more real, more powerful, more capable of influencing others. Think about how quickly fear spreads during a pandemic, or how collective rage moves through a nation during a crisis. It's not just that people are communicating with each other verbally. There's something deeper happening, an emotional contagion moving through the collective field that influences people independently of any direct communication. Jung called this the power of the collective. The way group consciousness can overwhelm individual consciousness, the way we're all influenced by the emotional and psychological currents moving through the broader collective. Most people feel this as a vague sense that something is in the air, but they can't quite articulate what it is. They just feel the collective mood shifting, the collective anxiety rising, the collective hope building. But empaths, they feel it acutely. They're hyper-attuned to these collective currents. They're like the canaries in the mine shaft. The first ones to pick up on collective emotional shifts, the first ones to feel collective anxiety before it becomes obvious, the first ones to sense collective rage before it erupts. In many ways, empaths serve as early warning systems for the collective psyche. They're perceiving what's happening in the collective unconscious. What's building, what's seeking expression, what's about to erupt, before it becomes visible to everyone else. But this puts enormous pressure on empaths. They're carrying the collective anxiety, the collective fear, the collective intensity, sometimes years before the broader population consciously perceives it, many empaths report feeling anxious or depressed without personal cause. They're actually picking up on collective emotional states, collective grief, collective trauma that are circulating through the collective unconscious. Jung understood this. He validated that these empaths weren't personally broken. They were genuinely perceiving something real, something happening in the collective field, something that needed consciousness and integration. The solution isn't to turn off their sensitivity. It's to understand what they're receiving, to distinguish between personal emotion and collective emotion, to process collective content with support rather than trying to carry it alone. Synchronicity, meaningful coincidence in the collective unconscious. One of Jung's most fascinating discoveries related to the collective unconscious is the concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence. Jung observed that events often occur in meaningful patterns that cannot be explained by cause and effect, by simple coincidence, or by rational causation. For example, you think about someone you haven't heard from in years, and within hours they call you. You're thinking about a particular book, and you randomly see that exact book 3 times in one day. You hear a song in your head, and then immediately hear it on the radio. Most people dismiss these as random coincidence, but Jung saw something deeper. He believed these were signs of connection at the level of the collective unconscious. Signs that consciousness is not separate, not isolated, but interconnected at deep levels. Synchronicity, Jung proposed, occurs when events align in meaningful ways through the collective unconscious, not through cause and effect, but through a deeper principle of meaningful connection. An archetypal pattern activates in your unconscious. Simultaneously, it activates in the external world, and meaning emerges at their intersection. This happens constantly, but most people are unconscious of it. Empaths, however, are highly attuned to synchronicity. They notice meaningful coincidences constantly. They perceive connections that others miss. They sense when something is meant to be, when events are aligning in significant ways. This is one reason empaths often describe themselves as intuitive or spiritual. They're literally perceiving the meaningful patterns that connect them to others, to events, to the broader flow of collective consciousness. Jung believed synchronicity proved that consciousness is fundamentally interconnected, that there's something deeper than individual separation, that we're all connected through the collective unconscious, and that empaths are simply more aware of this connection than most people. The empath's responsibility, bringing consciousness to the collective unconscious. Now we come to the crux of Jung's message about empaths and the collective unconscious, their responsibility, their calling, their purpose. Jung understood that empaths aren't gifted with their sensitivity just for their own benefit. They're called to serve the collective, to be channels for bringing consciousness to what's unconscious, to witness and help process collective content. In ancient cultures, empaths served as shamans, oracles, seers, healers. They were the ones who could perceive beyond ordinary consciousness, who could sense the collective needs, who could bring hidden truths to light. In modern culture, we've largely lost respect for this role. We've pathologized sensitivity. We've medicalized empath experience. We've tried to make empaths normal rather than honoring their extraordinary capacity, but Jung insisted that this was a mistake. Empaths need to understand their role. They need to recognize that their sensitivity is a form of consciousness, that their perception is valid, that they're literally perceiving deeper layers of reality that others miss. An empath's responsibility is not to absorb and fix others' pain, as many mistakenly believe. It's to witness it, to bring consciousness to it, to refuse to participate in collective denial, to speak truth that's been suppressed. When an empath speaks truth about what they perceive, when they refuse to numb to collective pain, when they insist on consciousness and integration, they're serving the collective's evolution toward greater awareness. Jung called this standing in the tension of opposites. The empath stands between the conscious and the unconscious, between what's visible and what's hidden, between what's acknowledged and what's denied. And by simply standing there, by witnessing, by refusing to look away, they bring light to darkness. This is why Jung said empaths are not healers. They're awakeners. They're not here to fix the collective's pain. They're here to illuminate it, to insist on consciousness, to refuse to let humanity remain asleep to its own shadow. But this can only happen if the empath understands their role, if they stop trying to fix and save, if they stop absorbing responsibility for others' healing, and instead focus on bearing witness, on speaking truth, on modeling consciousness, the integrated empath conscious connection to the collective unconscious. Finally, let's explore what Jung envisioned as the goal for empaths, becoming what we might call an integrated empath, someone who is consciously connected to the collective unconscious while maintaining their own individual wholeness. An integrated empath is someone who has done shadow work, who understands their personal unconscious, who has integrated their wounds, who has established healthy boundaries, but who remains open and attuned to the collective unconscious. They can feel collective currents without being overwhelmed by them. They can perceive archetypal patterns without being possessed by them. They can witness collective pain without absorbing it as personal pain. It's like the difference between a radio that's being overwhelmed by every frequency at maximum volume and a radio that can dial into specific frequencies at appropriate volumes, a tuned instrument rather than a chaos receptor. An integrated empath has consciousness about what they're receiving. They understand the difference between personal emotion and collective emotion, between their own shadow and humanity's shadow, between what belongs to them and what belongs to the broader collective. This consciousness changes everything. It transforms an empath from a victim of sensitivity into a conscious channel, from someone being overwhelmed to someone making conscious choices about what to receive and how to process it. Jung believed that the world desperately needs integrated empaths, people who can perceive what's happening in the collective unconscious, who can sense what's emerging, what's seeking expression, what needs consciousness and integration. In a world that's becoming increasingly unconscious in many ways, increasingly denying shadow, increasingly fragmented, increasingly lost, we need people who can perceive deeper currents, who can sense what's really happening beneath the surface, who can insist on truth and consciousness. An integrated empath can serve this role not by saving others, not by absorbing collective pain, but by being a conscious witness, a mirror for collective truth, an anchor for consciousness in a sea of unconsciousness. The collective unconscious and your empathic journey. So what is Carl Jung's ultimate message about empaths and the collective unconscious? First, the collective unconscious is real. It's not mystical or paranormal. It's a genuine layer of the human psyche that contains universal patterns, archetypes, and emotional content that influences all of us, whether we're conscious of it or not. Second, empaths are naturally porous to the collective unconscious. Their nervous systems are wired to pick up on subtle signals, emotional currents, archetypal patterns, and historical trauma that most people completely miss. Third, this gift is not a burden meant to overwhelm you. It's a capacity meant to serve consciousness, to witness what's hidden, to help humanity integrate its collective shadow, to insist on truth in a world built on denial. Fourth, you cannot fulfill this potential while unconscious. You must do shadow work. You must integrate your own wounds. You must understand what's personal and what's collective. You must establish boundaries while remaining open. Fifth, the world needs what you have to offer, not your self-sacrifice, not your endless giving, but your consciousness, your truth-telling, your refusal to participate in collective delusion. When you become an integrated empath, when you've done your inner work, when you've established boundaries while remaining open, when you've learned to distinguish between your personal shadow and humanity's collective shadow, then you become a genuine force for collective healing and evolution. You become a conscious channel for the collective unconscious to bring its hidden content into light. You become a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds. You become a witness to humanity's transformation. This is not a small calling. This is not a weakness to overcome. This is your purpose. This is why you were born with this sensitivity. This is what your gift is meant for. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He saw it clearly. He documented it throughout his life's work. And now you understand it too. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you continue to see your sensitivity as a burden, a flaw, something to overcome? Or will you recognize it for what it is, a capacity, a calling, a purpose? Will you do the inner work to become conscious, to integrate your shadow, to establish boundaries? Or will you remain unconscious, overwhelmed, lost in collective currents you don't understand? The choice is yours. But know this: the collective unconscious is always active. It's always broadcasting. It's always seeking consciousness through those who are sensitive enough to perceive it. You are one of those people, an empath, a receiver, a channel for collective consciousness. The question is not whether you'll feel the collective unconscious. You already do. The question is whether you'll become conscious of what you're feeling and use that consciousness to serve the world's evolution toward greater awareness and integration. Jung believed in your potential. He understood your gift. He left us a map for your transformation. All you have to do is follow it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being willing to understand yourself at this depth. Thank you for being an empath in a world that desperately needs people who can feel deeply and think clearly about what that feeling means.